The giant's larder. What surprised Rumo most when he was finally released from his stuffy prison was that he was no longer in the farmyard. He noticed to his astonishment that the ground beneath him kept rocking to and fro. However, he was quickly reassured to find that his family were all there too. Although the ground was unsteady, uneven, and slippery, he managed to stand up on his hind legs. But he couldn't grasp why everyone failed to notice this feat and congratulate him on it. Even his family were ignoring him, and their behavior was very odd in general. Their usually amiable faces had turned into tragic masks, and some of them had water trickling from their eyes. Rumo wondered where his basket was. Surely they hadn't left his basket behind. No, that was impossible. He was sick of this game. He wanted something nice to eat, a Hakonian lullaby and a little nap. The Hakonians took a different view of the situation. They had heard the rumors about roaming rock, and some of them had had grandparents or other relations abducted by the demonicals. They knew what awaited them unless some miracle occurred. To the demonicals, on the other hand, the situation was neither mysterious nor tragic, but simply satisfactory. They had just restocked their larder after a successful raid ashore. Now they were heading out to sea again, bound for a life of glorious freedom on the ocean waves. Rumo and the Hakonians were herded into a big cave in the heart of the roaming rock, in the demonicals' opinion the finest place on their island. This was where they stored their food, where they went fishing each morning to get their breakfast, and last thing, at night, to get their supper. Many of them even visited the cave in small hours, half asleep but eager for an unwholesome little midnight snack. Embedded in the walls of the vast cave were iron rings to which the Hakonians were secured with chains around their necks, wrists, or ankles. Basins hewn out of the rocky floor teemed with plump fish and octopuses. Wild animals, lynxes, bears, and lions were imprisoned in cages. Domesticated animals such as hens, pigs, horses, or cows roamed around freely behind the sliding wooden grill with which the demonicals shut off the mouth of the cave. Lobsters and crayfish crawled over and under each other in stone tubs and earthenware jars filled with seawater, which also contained oysters. The one thing roaming rock wasn't short of was live food. A sleepless night. Like most of the other inmates of the cave, Rumo didn't sleep a wink that night. What with the incessant motion, the puddles of the seawater sloshing to and fro, and the sobs and whimpers, grunts and cackles, whinnies and roars of his fellow captives, he had never before had to endure such uncomfortable conditions. The demonicals hadn't troubled to chain him up because they obviously rated him a harmless domesticated animal. What he found most shocking of all was that the Hakonians hardly spared him a glance when he tried to snuggle up to them. Chained to the wall, they wept continuously. Feeling hurt, Rumo went looking for affection elsewhere in the cave, but the same depressing atmosphere prevailed everywhere. Nobody wanted to play with him. Everyone was self-absorbed. Sobs and cries of despair filled the air. Rumo eventually took refuge in a niche with a narrow entrance. Originally formed in the volcanic rock by a fat, round air bubble, it afforded some protection from the seawater splashing around. He curled up and shut his eyes, but that only seemed to aggravate his seasickness, so he opened them again and simply lay there, as dejected and frightened as everyone else. It was the longest and worst night of Rumo's life to date. Every now and then a demonical would visit the cave for something to eat. A hen, a lobster, a pig, or a Hakonian. The hens cackled, the pigs squealed, and Hakonians screamed. Sleep was impossible under such circumstances. The noise became really deafening when one demonical felt peckish for a lion. Rumo had never seen a lion before, but he sensed the golden-maned creature in the biggest cage of all was a proud and dangerous beast. When the hungry demonical unbolted its cage, the beast emitted a sound that made the prisoner's blood run cold, a low growl which seemed to emanate from a natural disaster, not a living creature. Although anyone with any sense would have put as much distance as possible between himself and that sound, the demonical entered the cage without hesitation. The growl gave way to a roar that shook the walls of the cave. The demonical's hand shot out and grabbed the lion by the neck, winding its tail around the other wrist. He slung the huge cat over his shoulder like a sack of coals and plodded out. Rumo curled up again. What kept him awake, apart from the incessant din, was his sore mouth. The gum had swelled up in 2 new places, and this perturbed him almost more than the goings-on in the cave. From one day to the next, the world had become a hostile place. Even his own body was turning against him. He whimpered for a bit, and a few tears trickled down his nose. It was dawn by the time he fell into a brief, troubled sleep, filled with wild and sinister dreams. Breakfast time. The first thing Rumo noticed when he awoke was that the ground wasn't swaying as much. His fur was sodden with water dripping from the roof. He badly needed to pee, so he relieved himself outside his niche. Then he went on a tour and inspection to see if the situation had taken a turn for the better. Perhaps someone would play him with last. To begin with, it seemed unlikely. It was breakfast time, and grumpy, grunting their monocles were stomping around the cave in search of ingredients for the first meal of the day. Most of them favored pork for breakfast, so the squeals were ear-splitting. One monocle had decided on some octopus. He fished a huge 8-armed specimen out of the pool and promptly got into a tickle, much to his companion's amusement. The octopus wound its tentacles around one of the one-eyed giant's body, neck, and ankles, its suckers taking hold with a sound like someone smacking his lips. The monocle started to sway, lost his balance, and crashed into the ground. The companions threw back their heads and emitted gurgling noises, their way of laughing, Rumo gathered. The fallen giant struggled to his feet, grabbed one of the tentacles, and summarily tore it off. The octopus relaxed his grip, but it was too late for the conciliatory gestures. The monocle gripped 3 more tentacles in both hands and swung the octopus round his head like a hammer thrower, then smashed against the wall of the cave. It burst like a barrel of ink, spraying black liquid over everyone unlucky to be within range. Despite himself, Rumo vomited. When the demonicles left their larder at last, Rumo tottered over to a puddle on trembling legs and rinsed his mouth. He was so frightened that he had gone back to walking on all fours. It seemed safer. The water was lukewarm and brackish and tasted of fish. Rumo was just about to throw up again when he noticed a welcome development. One of the sore places his mouth stopped hurting. Something smooth and pointed had emerged there. He explored it with his tongue. It felt strange and somehow nice. Although the other places still hurt, they didn't worry him as much, now that one of them had undergone such a pleasant transformation. He too was hungry. He found a trough full of gooey mush, and some reluctantly at first. Then more and more greedily he noticed that the hollow sensation of his tummy was subsiding. Then he crawled back into his little niche for a closer inspection of his first tooth. Exploring it with his tongue again and again, he felt as if he had been given a present. Cries of mortal agony drifted in from outside. The demonicles were taking time over breakfast, and some of them were clearly eating it in the immediate vicinity of their larder. The Hakonians clung to each other, weeping and wailing even more loudly than before. Rumo noticed that the head of the family was missing, but that didn't surprise him. The farmer had often disappeared for days on end, only to return when he was least expected. Rumo went on another tour of the cave, sniffing the air as he went. He was finding it hard to get used to the smells given off by the sea, which were so utterly different from those of the farmyard. Everything there had smelt of soils, herbs, and life, whereas here only the scents were of rotting fish and death. He gave the cages containing wild animals a wide berth. Incredible how big and powerful many of them were. There was a red gorilla, a wild dog with 2 heads, another lion with only 1 eye, a huge polar bear with blood-stained fur. These beasts filled Rumo with a mixture of fear and wonder. The murky pools. But what he found really sinister were some deep, murky, dark pools in the side chamber of the cave, 8 circular basins, nearly all of which were filled with murky water. Capped in them with other sea creatures were giant squid. The color of the water came from the clouds of inky black fluid they excreted like a smoke screen when alarmed. Slimy tentacles, pointed horns, black dorsal fins, and glowing eyes on stalks broke the surface by turns, and issuing from one of the pools was a plaintive sing-song cry. During the night, Rumo had seen an inquisitive goat venture too close to the edge of one such basin. Without warning, a yellow tentacle equipped with fat suckers had emerged from the black, soupy water, wrapped itself around the animal's neck at less lightning speed. With a low gurgle, dragged it into the depths before it could even bleat. Since then, Rumo had maintained a respectful distance from the pools. Three of the artificial basins appeared to contain creatures with the demonicals kept as iron rations for their consumption when times were hard. Even they seemed to find them scary because they kept well clear of the pools in question. They contained no squid, so the water in them was clearer. To his astonishment, Rumo sighted some small but awe-inspiring denizens of the dark world inhabited by creatures with heavily armored scales and rows of fearsome teeth. They had grim faces with pugnaciously jutting lower jaws. Their eyes glowed and rolled wildly in their sockets as if they weren't entirely sane. Many of them had long antennae tipped with glowing balls like miniature lanterns. Rumo saw a pufferfish as transparent as glass with a heart pulsating inside it. He also spotted a long, thin oceanic worm that continually changed color as it wove its way along below the surface. He kept returning for another look at these fascinating prodigies of the deep and study their mysterious modes of behavior because they were the only things in the cave that helped him, for a moment or two at least, to forget his depressing surroundings. Most mysterious of all, however, was the furthermost basin, which was situated a little apart from the others at the back of the cave. The water was dark green, unlike that of blue-black pools, but just as cloudy. It struck to Rumo that none of the demonicals went near it, and that the free-range animals also kept their distance, mainly, no doubt, because of the foul stenches they gave off. Rumo would dearly have liked to know what sort of creature the oily surface concealed. For the most part, however, all that protruded from the murky soup was a big gray dorsal fin and a broad back that might have belonged to a whale or a fat sea cow. The baleful eye that somehow lurked beneath the surface resembled that of a marine predator. What particularly attracted Rumo to the furthermost basin were some faint vibrations he had picked up during the night while trying to sleep. In his mind's eye they had assumed the form of some concentric red ripples in the pool from which the dorsal fin occasionally protruded. The little Wooperting couldn't interpret these mental images, but he felt that they were trying to tell him something. Indeed, it was almost as if he could sense that this mysterious subaquatic creature wanted to get in touch with him. On the other hand, perhaps it was simply trying to lure him close enough to catch him. Rumo had refrained from obeying its signals and remained in hiding all night. However, he felt braver now that everyone was awake and actively reigned throughout the cave. For a while he growled around near the pool, but not so near that some slimy, sucker-studded tentacle could seize the opportunity to drag it into its murky depths. He gamboled around it on all fours. The eye beneath the surface revolved, observing his every movement, and when he had made 2 circuits, the dorsal fin rose slowly out of the water. It rotated on the spot like the iron pointer of a sundial, following him as he made his 3rd circuit. This went on for quite a while. Sometimes the fin sank below the surface, sometimes it resurfaced. Rumo sauntered off and returned, sauntered off and returned, but he never took his eyes off the pool. 2 creatures with no idea what to make of each other were engaged in covert mutual observation. A small party of demonicals entered the cave in search of the second helping of breakfast. Rumo always hid in his niche when the one-eyed giants visited the larder, so he scampered back there only to find that it was already occupied by the black goose, the same bird that had given him such a hard time back on the farm. With a roar, the leading demonical shooed away some hens, while the others looked around inquiringly. One of them grinned when he caught sight of Rumo and came stomping towards the little Wooperting. Rumo growled at the goose, hoping to scare her away, but she stuck out her tongue and gave a menacing hiss. The monocle stopped short, distracted by a litter of piglets. Rumo remembered the trick he'd tried before. He made himself as tall as the goose by rising on his hind legs. Then he growled again, louder and more menacingly than before, and bared his gums to display a solitary tooth. The bird did not hiss back this time, but waddled silently out of the niche so Rumo could sneak inside. The demonical caught him sight of the goose standing there at a loss. He licked his lips, reached her in 3 strides, and seized her by the neck. Qua was the last Rumo heard of her. The mysterious eye. A measure of peace and quiet returned once the giant had disappeared, clutching the goose by a handful of piglets. So Rumo ventured out of his hiding place. As if magnetically attracted to it, he approached the evil-smelling pool, with a mysterious eye in its depths. He prowled around its vicinity for a while, waiting for the creature to emerge in its entirety for once, but all that happened was a familiar sequence of events. The fin emerged when submerged. The eye appeared below the surface. A few bubbles rose sluggishly and burst with a pop. At length Rumo ventured a little closer, this time flat on his belly. He crawled nearer, inch by inch, until he was only a couple of feet from the edge. The unknown creature had submerged completely. Neither the fin nor the eye could be seen, just more fat green bubbles that burst with a pop and gave off a noxious stench. Lying there, undaunted, Rumo shut his eyes and strained his senses. Oh yes, the red vibrations were immensely strong. They seemed to pulsate in time with the beating of a mighty heart, slowly, steadily, and reassuringly. Unseen by Rumo, the water silently parted, and a massive gray form emerged from the dark green depths. It was a creature with the head and teeth of a big shark and the body of an abnormally bloated maggot. Hello, the creature said, in a sepulchral voice. Rumo's eyes snapped open. Horrified, he jumped back 3 or 4 feet and stood there on all fours, barking as viciously as a Wolperting whelp can. The creature made no move to leave the pool, still less attack him. Waving around on either side of its maggot-like body were 7 pairs of beauty little arms. Come here, the creature purred amiably. I won't hurt you. Although Rumo didn't understand a word, the creature's gentle, sonorous voice inspired confidence. He kept his distance, but he kept barking and merely growled. Come here, the creature repeated. Come on, I'm your friend. Gra-ra-gra, Rumo replied. He didn't know what it meant, but he felt bound to make some response. You can speak. Better and better. You're a Wolperting. Did you know that? Wapawa, said Rumo. Wolperting, the creature said again, pointing to him with several of its numerous fingers. Wapata, said Rumo. You learn fast. The creature laughed so hard the water slopped over the edge of the pool. Say smike, it said coaxingly. Rumo hesitated. Go on, say smike. My? Smike, say smike. Smy, said Rumo. Excellent. The creature gave another laugh. Smike, Volzaton Smike, that's my name. Volzaton Smike's story. Smike was a shark grub. As such, he was quite capable of Volzaton leaving the water and landing on land, but while on Roaming Rock, he felt it wiser to convey the impression that he was a sea creature pure and simple. At least 500 years old, according to his own rough estimate, he had heard many things about the demonicals in the course of his life to date, one of them being that they found land animals more to their taste than sea creatures. When the demonicals captured the pirate ship on which Volzaton Smike happened to be a passenger, he had promptly thrown himself into a tank filled with drinking water, and with a great historic panache, impersonated an obese, unappetizing sea creature. Although the demonicals were taken in by his act, they transported him back to their cave and stored him in one of the pools for consumption in an emergency. They devoured all the pirates within a month, but Smike miraculously survived. However, he was feeling rather unwell in his watery element. True, he could breathe underwater if he chose, but that was just an embarrassing legacy inherited by his aquatic ancestors whom he despised. He would have preferred to disavow that part of his family tree, but in his present predicament he clung to it desperately because his ancestors were, so to speak, saving his life every day. Smike had been living in this pool on Roaming Rock for 2.5 years, by far the longest period any creature had spent in the demonical's larder. This had given him time to study their habits, or at least those they indulged in when visiting the cave. He had been compelled to listen to their gruesome singing, the discordant din made by their seashell horns, and their totally unrhythmical drumming. Smike estimated that these performances occurred every 6 months at particular phases of the moon and went on for days, so he could tell when their next festivity, or orgy, was due. This knowledge was vitally important because the demonical's gluttony on such occasions could spell the premature end of every living creature on the cave. Smike had to witness the disappearance of several captured ships' crews in quick succession. Indeed, 1 or 2 prisoners had been eaten alive before his very eyes. When these festivities were at their height, it was not uncommon for a drunken demoniacal to come storming into the cave, tear a shrieking victim to pieces, and devour him in the presence of his horrified fellow captives. At such times, blood seemed to affect the demonicals in such the same way as a high-proof liquor. While these atrocities were in progress, Volzaton Smike dived as deep as he could and excreted a substance from his sebaceous glands that dyed the pool dark green, transforming it into a malodorous soup so unappetizing that even the demonicals found it repulsive. He hated doing this because it reminded him of another still more unpleasant branch of his family tree, at the lower end, which came the primeval sulphur grub, a creature whose offensive smell was all that had enabled it to survive in a world full of voracious dinosaurs. Smike could hardly endure the stench himself, but in this case the end really did justify the means. So as not to become demented under these conditions, Smike had created a fantasy world of his own. He regarded his sojourn on Roaming Rock as an ordeal imposed on him by fate, and designed to toughen him for his further journey through life. He was like a sword by being tempered in the furnace. That was his favorite image of himself, little though it accorded with his physical appearance. Nothing in the world was more terrible than the constant fear of being eaten alive. Equally, all of this was just convinced nothing could better steel one to resist terrors of all kinds. If he survived Roaming Rock, he kept telling himself, death would have lost its sting. Smike's memories were another powerful aid in his fight for survival on Roaming Rock. It was the only in captivity that he had learned to appreciate moments of happiness experienced in the past. In the corridors of his brain, he had constructed a chamber to be visited whenever his hopes had been dashed yet again. When his fear was at its greatest, and despair overpowering, this was the chamber of memories. Major and minor incidents in his life hung on his walls like oil paintings, frozen in time and waiting for him to reactivate them. These mental images would have meant nothing to anyone else. They could be a view across a gloomy bay or a little hillside inn at dusk, a battlefield in turmoil, a chessboard bearing an exceptionally complicated arrangement of pieces, or a leg of roast pork with a knife about to carve it. When Smike stood in front of one of these pictures and devoted his attention to it, it seemed to come to life, expand, and literally suck him in. He then experienced some pleasurable memory as if for the first time. Such was the solitary skill he had developed at the bottom of his pool. It was neither thinking nor dreaming, but a mental activity that lay midway between the two, one that he immodestly termed smiking. It was the art of not remembering, but of reliving remembrance. Smike used to reactivate these memories as required. Some of them were big and dramatic, others small, simple, and intimate. It afflicted with hunger and yearning for something more varied to eat than seaweed and plankton, the monocles tossed into his pool, Smike would summon up the image of a little inn at dusk. There, over 100 years ago, he had enjoyed his life's most satisfying gastronomic experiences. He had dined outside on the terrace, which afforded a panoramic view of a bay that glowed orange at night thanks to the phosphorescent jellyfish that congregated there as the season of the year. Smike started with a whole baked truffle encased in pâté foie gras, and went on to the slaked jellyfish on a bed of algae, followed by a Venus's shell risotto and a ginger salad and a cream dressing scented with lemongrass, and rounded off the meal with some 5-year-old Grelsundian blue and a bottle of cataclysmian port. Although this was a rather trivial memory, Smike relived it more often than any of the others. Only one mental image in his chamber of memories, an exceptionally large one, was permanently covered up. Smike always hurried past this picture, which was draped in a black cloth, but he couldn't delete it from his mind. Other memories were preserved in urns. The wall of the chamber were lined with little pillars bearing urns of various colors. If Smike opened one of these vessels, the smell would issue from it. The scent of fresh snow, the dusty odor of an ancient book, rain falling on a city street in springtime, the smoke from a campfire, a wine cork straight for the bottle, oven-warm bread, a cup of coffee. Each of these smells set off a chain reaction of memories in which Smike could lose himself for hours, if only for a while. They made him forget his fear and despair until the blare of the seashell horn or the rattle of the grill over the mouth of the cave jolted him back to reality, and now in this harsh reality stumbled a wolperting puppy that still walked on all fours, yet hadn't yet learned to speak and seek sick from time to time. Smike knew that this little creature personified the reason why he had constructed his chamber of memories. It embodied the hope that had kept him going in the depths of his stinking pool, the one remaining desire he still cherished in this dreadful world, to escape from roaming rock. This personification of his desire required a name. Walton Smike decided. He didn't take long to think of one. There was a Simonian card game, a particular favorite of his, in which the most important card, and the one that gave the game its name, was known as the Rumo. If you played a Rumo, you were challenging fate and risking everything, absolutely everything. On the other hand, you could score a resounding victory, and that was how Rumo got his name. Words and pictures. Rumo, said Rumo. That's right, Smike exclaimed. You Rumo, me Smike. You Rumo, me Smike, Rumo repeated eagerly. No, Smike chuckled. You Rumo, me Smike. You Rumo, me Smike, Rumo said defiantly, slapping his chest with his forepaw. Smike taught Rumo to speak, or rather Rumo could already speak. All he needed were the right words, and those he learnt simply by sitting beside the pool and listening to the shark grab. At first it seemed to him that the creature was emitting a hodgepodge of hisses, croaks, and noises that made no sense, but he soon noticed that many of these sounds conjured up mental images, while others generated emotions like fear, or bewilderment, or gaiety. Still others filled his head with geometrical shapes and abstract patterns. The little wolperting soaked up these strange sounds like a sponge. Certain of Smike's utterances made heavenly music ring out of Rumo's ears, and suffused his whole body with an unaccountable feeling of happiness. Sometimes he pictured things he couldn't put a name to, big dark city in which many fires were burning, or a mountain range agleam with snow, or a desert valley shimmering with intense heat. Then again he would fall into a trance, dreaming with his eyes wide open and his heart beating wildly. He could still see Smike swimming in the pool and gesticulating with his 14 arms, but a stream of events, sensations, and presentiments flowed through his body. He felt as if the words were penetrating his brain in 1,000 places and exploding there, and the images they conjured up formed themselves into confused, incoherent scenes that followed and obliterated each other in quick succession. It was as if an immense wealth of age-old experience had been slumbering within him. Now it had awakened and sprung potently to life. No, Smike didn't teach Rumo to speak. He merely roused the words inside him from their sleep. Yes, Rumo kept exclaiming. Go on, go on. Words, images, sensations. Rumo couldn't get enough of them. Smike's favorite topic was fighting. He himself was no fighter, that was obvious, but his knowledge of the theoretical aspects of the subject was second to none. He had made a meticulous study of all forms of fighting. Sporting contests, pitched battles in the field, duels to the death with sabers, boxing matches with padded gloves, rapid-fire shootouts with crossbows, the marsh dwellers' ancient art of cudgel fighting, the bloodums' appallingly sanguinary affrays with ball and chain. Smike had witnessed duels in which adversaries daubed with pitch set each other ablaze with flaming torches. Armed with a magnifying glass, he had spent days watching the incredibly bloody battles waged by rival ants' nests. He could tell of the contests that brought you out in a sweat at the sight and sound of opponents breaking each other's bones. Rumo was so enthralled by Smike's anecdotes that he sometimes sat beside the pool like a spectator at a prize fight, punching the air with his little paws clenched. Smike had referenced the Fang Fang's professional boxing matches. He had also been a military advisor during the Northlanders' guerrilla wars, and officially licensed second at the duels between the Florenthian aristocrats and the timekeeper of the Wolperting's chess tournaments in Betaville. Other professional capacities in which he had served included cockfight organizer, treasurer of the Zemonian Vermuluct, an annual wrestling match between Orny and Strangleworms, cheerleader at the Midgardian dwarf joust, and croupier at Fort Una, the city where gambling went around the clock. No, Smike was no fighter, he was a gambler, which is why he studied contests and contestants, and analyzed victories and defeats of all kinds. Anyone who knew how contests functioned could bet on their outcome. That was Smike's ruling passion, his raison d'etre, steadily improving his ability to know who would win. I once watched a fight between two hydroscorpions, he remarked one day, out of the blue, and Rumo pricked up his ears. Hydroscorpions, he thought, and something small with lots of legs went scuttling through his head. Hydroscorpions are tiny but highly venomous creatures with 7 extremely mobile tails, each of which is tipped with a poisonous sting, Smike went on. Rumo shuddered. Would you like to hear how the fight turned out? Yes, please, Rumo said eagerly. The hydroscorpions. It was in a desert, and I happened to be at a loose end, so I watched those 2 venomous creatures and made a bet with myself. I bet on the smaller, more agile scorpion. At first they merely danced around each other in the sand, a stiff, decorous dance, like that of 2 courtiers in olden times. Then all at once it happened. The larger scorpion fainted, lashed out, killed the smaller one in an instant, and devoured it. Crash, bang, wallop, all over. I'd lost my bet with myself and won it at the same time. Rumo knitted his brow and thought hard. But the most surprising thing of all happened after that. Having devoured its opponent, the vicious scorpion stung itself in the head, went into convulsions, and died in agony. Oh, said Rumo. Later I had this explained to me by someone who knew all about the hydroscorpions. He explained that they were male and female. Male and female? Yes, they were a couple, said Smike, and this, as if this concluded his story with satisfactory moral. They were in love, you see? No, said Rumo, I don't. Neither do I, Smike sighed. On that note, he submerged. Rumo lay awake for a long time that night, trying to read some meaning into the words male and female. He failed, and besides, new teeth were about to emerge 3 different points in his mouth. On the other hand, 4 more had already done so. He enjoyed running his tongue over them, delighting in their smooth sides and sharp points and cutting edges. His mouth would soon be as full of such teeth as that of a big white bear in his cage. Then he fell asleep after all. He dreamt that he was an immense, muscular, menacing bear, with snow-white fur and silver teeth. He rose on his hind legs and emitted a fearsome roar, and swarms of shadowy figures fled from him in terror. The little Wolperting laughed in his sleep. Smike's 5 rules. By now, Rumo was moving around the cave with somewhat more self-confidence. There are 5 rules which Smike had impressed upon him, which he strictly observed. Rule number 1. Keep away from cages containing wild animals. Rule number 2. Keep away from pools containing creatures with tentacles. Rule number 3. Never try to climb over the sliding grill. Rule number 4. Hide in your niche when demonicals appear. Rule number 5. If you fail to make it to your niche, keep as still as you can when demonicals are around. Rumo enjoyed more freedom than any other prisoner in the cave. He wasn't locked up, tethered, or chained, and he didn't have to hide underwater. He could help himself to any of the food or water troughs apart from those of the wild animals. He could explore every nook and cranny and was the only free-range inmate of the cave with a sleeping place hidden from the demonical's gaze. He also enjoyed the privilege, when fear threatened to overwhelm him, of being able to call on Volzaton Smike for a story, particularly when the demonicals made a racket with their conch horns and drums, an incessantly frequent occurrence of late. Rumo used to sneak off to Smike for something to take his mind off the alarming din. Tell me a story, he commanded on such occasions. Smike enjoyed telling Rumo stories because, figuratively speaking, They transported him as far from Roaming Rock as they did the little Wolperting. Would you like to hear the story of the Battle of Lindworm Castle? Asked Smike. A battle! Rumo exclaimed. Yes, please. The story of Lindworm Castle. Smike inhaled so deeply he might have been intending to recount the story in a single breath. The story of Lindworm Castle is the oldest story in Zamonia, possibly the oldest story in the world, he began. Are you ready to listen to Zamonia's longest and oldest story, my boy? Rumo nodded. It's billions of years old. Smike waved his 14 arms dramatically. Billions? Rumo wasn't expressing surprise, just imitating the word. Yes, billions. A billion is 1,000 million, and 1,000,000 years are 1,000,000, but you'll learn all that soon enough. What matters is 1,000,000,000 years ago, a very small animal appeared in the ocean, the world's first living creature. Out there in the water? Yes, out there in the ocean. What kind of animal? Smite racked his brains. The youngster was starting to ask some disconcerting questions. What kind of creature? Something beginning with it was on the tip of his tongue, but anyway, was animal the correct term for the creature he was thinking of? Smike was shocked at himself. After all, he had once done a 3-week course on Zamodian paleontology at the night school in Florence. That was, good heavens, that was 150 years ago already. What kind of animal? Smike couldn't remember. Hadn't the living creatures been cells? Cells that divided? Oh, didn't cells count as living creatures? Didn't 2 cells have to combine in order to produce a living creature, which then divided or something like that? He really must brush up on his knowledge of paleontology and biology and science in general. That's immaterial. What matters is the animal was very small and it, divided into 2. Divided into 2? Yes, divided into 2. What are you, a parrot? A parrot? Smite became aware that it was quite some time since he had told a long, coherent story. He had definitely gone back too far. Anyway, the animal divided into 2 and formed other animals. Those animals developed jaws, grew scales, and teeth. Teeth! Cried Rumo, proudly bearing his little stumps, but Smike ignored the interruption. They grew bigger and bigger, and they went ashore. They were the dinosaurs. That's one way out, thought Smike, short and painless. Dinosaurs. For the first time ever, Rumo was rather getting on the shark crab's nerves. Until now, his questions had always amused Smike and provoked him into giving detailed explanations, but today his patience was sorely tired. The drumming had started again some days ago. He was the only one who realized that terrible events lay in store, events that could steal the fate of every living creature in the cave, and this knowledge was preying on his mind. The story of Lindworm Castle had been meant to distract himself as well, and now Rumo kept interrupting. Yes, dinosaurs, or dragons, or lindworms, if you like, big, powerful lizards. Some of them, the herbivores, were merely big. Others were vicious, predatory carnivores. They had huge claws and teeth, were encased in scales and gristle, and could be up to 100 feet long. The dinosaurs were enormous monsters. Oh, said Rumo. Now I've captured his attention, thought Smike. Monsters always do the trick. So these monsters, these dinosaurs, went ashore all over the world. The one place where they remained in the water was Loch Loch, the big volcanic lake between the end of the Demon Range and the Dulsgard Plateau. Unlike the oceans, which were cooling, Loch Loch retained its warmth because of the volcano that heated it from below. It also had large underwater caves in which the monsters could dwell in safety. The dinosaurs of Loch Loch thought, why should we traipse around outside when it's so nice and warm in here? So they remained at the lake while the other dinosaurs conquered terra firma. Then came the great catastrophe. Catastrophe? What a great big word, thought Rumo. It seemed to portend something bad. Yes, some huge meteorites came crashing down from outer space. A gigantic dust cloud enshrouded the whole of Zamonia for millions of years, and the dinosaurs died out, all except the ones in Loch Loch. They went on living in their underwater caves, mated with the surviving dinosaurs of other breeds, and developed bigger brains. It was only then that they went ashore. Rumo opened his mouth to ask what mate meant, but Smike went on quickly. So there they were, standing around on dry land, and wondering what to do next. It was cold and draughty. The winter was on its way, but right beside Loch Loch stood a mountain riddled with caves and tunnels. It was warm and windproof inside like a huge tilled stove, because it had been heated for thousands of years by the waters of the lake, so the dinosaurs crawled inside. That's to say, the ones that could squeeze through the openings did so. The others, the really big ones, had to remain outside and were frozen to death. Frozen, Rumo repeated in a whisper, shivering. The mountain was swarming with blind marmots. They were easy to catch and didn't taste too bad, so the dinosaurs survived their first winter on dry land. To begin with, they ate the marmots raw. But one day, a shaft of lightning ignited some straw, and they discovered fire. They learned how to cook. From then on, their menu included barbecued marmot kebabs and marmot soup and marmots encased in clay and baked in glowing charcoal until they were done, all soft and juicy inside, and on the outside. Smike broke off. A distant blare of seashell horns came drifting in from the cave, and the drums resumed their nerve-wracking, thunderous din. Smike cleared his throat. The dinosaurs hollowed out the mountain some more and made it habitable. Because the winters were so cold, they were used to living in warm water. They started to wear clothes. Marmots skinned cloaks at first, but then they stole some sheep from the neighboring farms, invented spinning wheels and looms, and wove garments of wool. They also learned how to smelt iron from the ore of which the mountain was composed. In short, they were clearly skilled at handicrafts and became steadily more intelligent and civilized. The local inhabitants had no idea they were dinosaurs because dinosaurs had long been extinct, so they mistook them for dragons or lindworms and believed them capable of breathing fire and devouring damsels. Anyway, they treated them with great respect and christened their mountain Lindworm Castle. Rumo carefully memorized the name. The Lindworms, as the dinosaurs now called themselves, maintained distant but friendly relations with the people round about. Once they had ridden them of their superstitious prejudices as regards the devouring of damsels, they carried out a modest trade in manufactured goods and foodstuffs, but never allowed them inside their stronghold. They fortified the entrances and carved staircases, doors, and windows, tunnels, and caverns out of the rock. The whole mountain was transformed into a big, well-defended fortress. As the Lindworms' mental powers steadily developed, so their savage dinosaurian instincts withered away. Having hitherto communicated in a mixture of grunts and sign language, they learnt Samonian from the farmers and traders with whom they came into contact. Later they began to record their words and thoughts into writing. Language was one of their principal pleasures. They took to speaking in rhyme, wore long robes and elaborate jewelry. They became artists, do you understand? Artists and poets. Rumo stared at Smike uncomprehendingly. No, you don't understand. No normal living creature could, but never mind. They liked to regard themselves as something special. Because they could write poetry, they thought their sweat smelt like perfume. The little Wolperton yawned. In other words, the Lindworms became soft. Get it? They lost their natural instincts. They wore flashy clothes and weird made-to-measure helmets designed to protect them from the fragments of rock that sometimes broke off. They paraded around in jewelry fashioned from the mountain's deposits of iron ore and crystal. No wonder the local inhabitants started to gossip. Before long, it was rumored that the occupants of Lindworm Castle were a bunch of effeminate lizards knee-deep in gold and diamonds, easy meat for anyone courageous enough to storm their stronghold. One thing led to another until one day a besieging army suddenly appeared at the foot of Lindworm Castle. Rumo sat up with a start. Some fighting at last. It was all a rabble of ill-organized yetis. Some 200 of them, perhaps. They kicked up a din, hammered on the locked gates, and yelled insults at the Lindworms, who tipped a few buckets of pitch over them, and that was that. The pitch smeared the yetis with druze. They only attacked unfortified villages after that. Rumo subsided. But then came the Darkmen. Rumo sat up again. More fighting! The Darkmen were twice as numerous as the Yetis and better armed. They came equipped with scalding ladders and battering rams, and they were a fearsome-looking crew, having daubed themselves with pitch from head to foot, hence their name. There would have been a little point in tipping pitch over them, so the Lindworms used molten lead instead. That put paid to the second siege as well. The Darkmen didn't go anywhere after that. Smite grinned. But that was when it really started. Rumors of the treasures of Lindworm Castle became ever more fanciful and exaggerated. If the Lindworms defended themselves so stoutly, it was said, they must have something to hide. There were stories of caverns filled with gold coins and precious stones, of mines in which rubies the size of fists could be chipped from the walls with a hammer, of the so-called Lindworm Diamond, which was reputed to be as big as a house, of a secret tunnel to the center of the earth, which the scientists of those days believed to consist of molten gold, and those were only the commonest theories about the Lindworm's treasures. Every wayfarer, every adventurer, every fairground charlatan had a version of his own, and before long half the population of Zamonia was fantasizing about them. Every mercenary eager to line his pockets put the capture of Lindworm Castle at the very top of his list. As you can imagine, it was besieged again and again by armies of bloodums, werewolves, demonic warriors, and every kind of loathsome riffraff to be found in Zamonia. But the Lindworms had only boiled up some tar and lead and tip it over them, and the besiegers got the worst of it. Indeed, plain boiling water did the trick in many cases. Smike reeled off a whole series of attackers. Mad Prince Ognagog, with his cadaverous cannibals, the stone giants, the horrendous horde, the venomous vampires, the implacable impalers, the sinister slayers, the diabolical death heads, all of whom had been deluged with tar or lead or water or all three. It was the same every time. Rumo's eyelids drooped. And then, Smike said abruptly in a low voice, came the copper killers. Rumo didn't know why, but there was something about the way Smike laid stress on those words that made him prick up his ears. The copper killers. The words seemed to have been slumbering deep inside him, and now they came to life. They sounded ominous. Rumo was suddenly wide awake. Someone rattled the grill over his mouth of the cave and grunted malevolently. Smike and Rumo gave a start, and their fellow prisoners milled around in alarm. Then the demonicals walked off, laughing, and silence fell. That's the demonicalian sense of humor for you, said Smike. Go on, Rumo insisted. Ah, yes, the copper killers. Where besiegers were concerned, they really did represent an improvement in quality, because they were said to be a cross between living creatures and machines. They made them considerably tougher and harder to wound, let alone kill, than ordinary troops. The copper killers were products of the legendary Battle of Nern Forest. Ah! A battle, Rumo whispered. Smike grinned and leant forward. You mean like to hear the story of the Battle of Nern Forest before I go on with the siege of Lindworm Castle, are you sure? Rumo nodded. A wise decision, because one story can't be understood without the other. But I must warn you, Smike raised several of his arms in an admonitory fashion. It's terrible, bloodthirsty tale, probably the craziest episode in the history of Zamonia. Do you really want to hear it? The faint flush that had appeared on Smike's face was a mark of excitement. He was into his stride. His troubles seemed temporarily forgotten, and the words flowed from his lips in a steady stream. Yes, yes, Rumo exclaimed. Go on. The Battle of Lindworm Castle. Very well, my boy. The Battle of Nern Forest was one of the worst bloodbaths in the annals of Zamonia. It was fought between two armies made up of every conceivable type of creature found on the mainland. Demons, bloodums, werewolves, the whole caboodle. The actual reason for the battle was lost in the mists of time. We only know that when it was over, neither side could regret having started it because all involved were dead. All dead? Rumo said disappointedly. Was the battle over already? Well, not all of them were really and truly dead. Many of the warriors had been butchered, but a lot of them were still alive, maimed and cut to ribbons, but more or less alive. Smike sighed hoarsely. He sounded like one of those warriors breathing on his last on the battlefield. Try to picture this scene. The gloomy depths of Nern Forest, wreathed in swaths of mist. Strewn across the blood-sodden grass were swords, pieces of armor, helmets, spears, breastplates, mailed gauntlets, greaves, clubs, battered shields, crossbows, balls and chains, knives, axes, halberds, splintered glass daggers, iron whips, knuckle-dusters. The participants of the Battle of Nern Forest were the best-equipped warriors of their day, so it said. Then they were all dead and maimed. The severed arms and legs and heads, and ears and noses and fingers and lips and eyebrows, whatever else a blade can hack off. The branches of the surrounding trees were thick with ravens and crows, lured to the scene by the moans of the dying, the scent of the blood. The avid croaking and calling filled the air, interspersed with cries of pain, vile oaths, and death rattles. The birds hopped impatiently from foot to foot.